Chapter 15. Nate took off his big knapsack and grabbed some ammunition cartridges. He stuffed them into his pockets. Then he crawled back to his tree. He held his weapon like Samuel had showed him and aimed up the hill. He could see the soldiers in their bloodied coats hiding in the trees. It looked like only about 20 men. Probably soldiers sent ahead of scouts. He waited for Captain Marsh's orders. "Present!" Captain Marsh shouted. Nate clicked back the flintlock, holding his aim. "Fire!" Nate pulled the trigger. Crack! The gunpowder exploded inside the gun. The musket ball streaked out of the barrel like a comet, trailing flames and smoke. The other men shot at the same time, and Nate's musket ball joined theirs in the blizzard of metal sweeping up the hill. The redcoats scattered. Nate and the men all reloaded. He aimed again, ready to shoot, but the redcoats didn't come back. They all waited for them to return. Minutes ticked by. Finally, Captain Marsh gave the order for them to line up again. "We need to get to our camp, men," he shouted. Nate stood up. "Captain!" he called. "It's Samuel, sir." A moment later, all the men were gathered around Samuel's body. Martin knelt down and put his hand on Samuel's blood-soaked chest. He looked up at Captain Marsh. "He's gone, sir." Captain Marsh's stony face seemed to crumble for a moment, and then he regained his steely determination. The men all said a prayer, and then they stood silently. But then a chilling song scattered the moment. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, battle drums, like from Nate's nightmare. Except these were real, and these sounds got louder. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat! "What will we do, Captain?" Paul asked. Paul had an unusual look in his eyes, one that Nate had only seen once before during the storm that took Papa. It was fear. "We need to get back to the fort," Captain Marsh said. But it was too late. Before they could take the step, the ground started to shake, and it sounded like a stampede of giants were heading right for them. And in a way, that was exactly what was happening. Suddenly, hundreds of soldiers were charging over the top of the ridge. They were not redcoats. They were not American. They wore dark green and red uniforms and tall, pointed silver hats. They carried muskets topped with long, glinting bayonets. "Hessians!" The hillside exploded into a wall of flames and gunpowder smoke. Balls hissed by, smacking into the trees and cutting holes into the ground. And this time, there was no way for the men of the Connecticut Fifth to shoot back. The Hessians were pouring over the hills like a churning wave of green and red and silver. "Retreat!" Captain Marsh bellowed. The men scattered in different directions. Paul grabbed Nate by the arm, and they tore through the woods. Cannon blasts rang out. Boom! Boom! That evil, sizzling sound of approaching cannonballs filled the air. Crash! A cannonball shattered a tree right in front of them. Shards of wood flew like daggers. A sharp piece hit Nate on the cheek, an inch from his eye. Paul lost his grip on Nate. The smoke was so thick now that Nate could hardly see. He lost Paul and ran almost blindly, stumbling over the rocks and weaving around the trees. Musket balls whizzed by. Nate heard footsteps behind him. "Paul!" But when he looked over his shoulder, he didn't see his friend. Instead, he saw a man in a silver hat. A Hessian. He was chasing after Nate with his bayonet held straight out in front of him, shouting angrily in a language that Nate had never heard. But Nate did not need to understand the words. Even through the smoke, Nate could see the hatred and fury in the man's eyes. Nate wanted to scream, "I'm not a soldier!" But it didn't matter that Nate was just an 11-year-old boy. That Hessian meant to kill him. Nate's legs were giving out. He was slowing down. He braced for the vicious stab, for the agonizing pain, for the end. But then a cannonball sizzled overhead. And it wasn't a regular cannonball. It was an exploding shell. Kaboom! This world around Nate seemed to shatter apart. And then whoosh! In the same instant, Nate was ripped up off the ground. There was searing heat, blinding light, and then just darkness. Chapter 16, 2 hours later. Nate opened his eyes. Where was he? He seemed to be inside of a big, deep hole. There was dirt and grass everywhere, even in his mouth. He must be in his grave. He had been buried alive. He sat up, coughing and gasping. No, this hole was not a grave. And Nate was still alive. Explosions and the smell of gunpowder smoke helped clear his mind, and then he remembered the redcoat attack. Samuel, Hessians charging over the hill, that grunting soldier with his bayonet, and the explosion. It must have been a shell, one of those new exploding cannonballs. It had blasted this crater into the ground. Somehow Nate had tumbled inside of it. Nate struggled to his feet, checked himself from head to toe. His pants were ripped. The cut on his face was oozing blood. He felt like he'd been run over by a horse wagon, but amazingly he was in one piece. He spat the dirt from his mouth and turned around, then reeled back in fear. There was a hand, a bloody hand, emerging from the edge of the crater. Nate crept closer until he could see that the hand was attached to a man, the Hessian. The soldier was splayed out on his back with his one leg twisted in a way that it shouldn't be, his silver cap next to him, the musket and bayonet near his feet. His eyes were open wide, just unblinking. Nate wanted to turn away, but he couldn't. The Hessian's eyes seemed to grab hold of Nate's, forcing him to look. He was very young. Nate could see around Paul's age. He didn't look like a bloodthirsty killer anymore. He just looked like someone's son, like an older brother. Nate stood there until finally a cannon blast from somewhere very close jolted him out of this trance. The battle was still raging, and he felt like he had woken up from one nightmare only to be locked inside of a new one. Cannons and musket fire seemed to be crackling on both sides of him. The air was thick with smoke. What had happened to Paul and the men? How would Nate get back to the fort on Brooklyn Heights? That's what Captain Marsh had told them to do. But how? He couldn't just stroll right through the woods. There were redcoats and Hessians everywhere. Nate might not be a real soldier, but he sure looked like one. He was tall for his age. He was wearing the frontier shirt that James had given him. He looked like any young American soldier desperate to escape. Terrifying thoughts screamed through his mind. He'd been shot, crushed by a cannonball. He could be caught and locked away in a rat-filled prison. The men had told terrible stories about how the British treated the American prisoners. They crammed them into filthy basements or old rotting ships. Most men died slowly of starvation or fevers. Paul said he'd rather get shot on the battlefield than starve to death in a British prison. Nate started to shake. He looked at the big hole in the ground. Maybe he should just climb back into it and curl up into a ball. I mean, what else could he do? And then once again his mind flashed to the pirate Slash O'Shea. He remembered a story that Papa had told him about a time when Slash was in London. He'd been working as a pirate for a few years, and he had come ashore to hand out gold coins to poor kids on the streets. A policeman spotted Slash and started to chase him. Slash managed to duck into a tavern. Inside was a man wearing a fancy blue velvet coat and a top hat. Slash dug into his pockets and pulled out a handful of gold coins. He slapped them onto the table in front of the man. "For your coat and hat, sir." A minute later, Slash was strolling out of the tavern in the fancy outfit. He strolled right past a group of policemen, tipping his hat like a gentleman. Slash escaped from London that night and was soon back at sea. Nate looked at the Hessian, lying on the ground, and he knew what he had to do. He knelt down and unbuttoned the brass buttons of the green coat. It was wrong to steal from a dead man, but this dead man had tried to kill him. Nate carefully slipped the coat off the man's body. He shook it out and tried it on. It hung down past Nate's knees, but Nate could easily fix that. He shrugged it off and used the Hessian's razor-sharp bayonet to help him tear off the bottom of the coat. He tried it on again. Better. Next he put on the helmet. He had to push it back so that it didn't cover up his eyes. Finally, he picked up the Hessian's musket and bayonet and put it over his shoulder. Nate stood there too scared to move. He just had to get out of the woods and cross the field into the fort. It was only about a mile from here, Nate guessed. If he walked quickly, he'd be back inside the fort in 15 minutes. But looking ahead, Nate felt like he had to cross an ocean, without a boat, in a storm, by himself. He closed his eyes, and there it was, the feeling of Papa's hand on his shoulder. He moved his fingers and imagined Eliza's hand on his, and he started.